details surrounding his death, this apparent ongoing investigation into his death, honestly, I don't even know how much more shocking you can get.
Police expected a routine check at Hulk Hogan's Florida home until they uncovered something buried deep in his garden that changed the entire investigation, as a sealed chamber, hidden documents, and encrypted devices raised shocking questions about Hogan's final days and shifted everything we thought we knew about his story. The police report showed that the first officer arrived at Hogan's Clearwater property at 7:42 a.m., less than 9 days after his confirmed death, a timeline backed by public death notices and local coverage from outlets like the Tampa Bay Times. Neighbors had reported strange movement along the garden wall, wording similar to earlier nuisance complaints filed in the Clearwater beachfront area, and although officers first assumed it was a simple disturbance, the call quickly turned into the most significant discovery ever linked to Hogan's home. The find pushed investigators to immediately look deeper into his final days, his private medical issues, and the legal conflicts surrounding his estate, challenging earlier beliefs that his death was entirely natural. The officer followed the usual perimeter sweep used for high-profile properties as described in Clearwater police procedure, and the property itself, which had been widely shown online during tax assessments, included a long, carefully maintained garden stretching toward the eastern fence. Hogan had even mentioned items he kept around the property in past interviews, such as personal memorabilia, equipment, and old pinball machines, unknowingly hinting at a home filled with secrets waiting to be uncovered.
And we have like storage places, around Clearwater Beach with all my stuff in. Pinball machines, wrestling buddies, yellow boots with Andre the Giant's blood on them, the real blood from Andre.
That quote had always been treated as harmless nostalgia. But after his death, investigators began to view every mention of his on-site or off-site storage in a completely different light. When officers first stepped into the garden for their routine sweep, nothing in their initial notes suggested they expected anything unusual, and the body cam observations later summarized in internal memos shared indirectly with reporters stated that the garden looked untouched except for some disturbed soil near the back hedges. Everything shifted when the second officer spotted a partially uncovered metallic container buried deeper than normal irrigation lines and marked with erosion patterns that did not match typical Florida weather conditions. Public meteorological records from the National Weather Service Tampa Bay office confirmed that Clearwater had seen no storms, flooding, or strong winds capable of disrupting soil at that depth in the days before the discovery, which made the container immediately suspicious. Inside the exposed section of the container, officers found documents, medical letters, and a sealed electronic device wrapped in protective film, and this moment was officially labeled the flag event, a term Clearwater police use for evidence that could change the direction of an investigation. The department had already been reviewing the circumstances of Hogan's death, a fact supported by multiple credible reports including recent coverage from Law and Crime, which cited police statements acknowledging the unusual aspects of the case and quoted spokesperson Rob Shaw confirming that investigators were examining medical files and speaking with witnesses. Because of this ongoing review, the discovery in the garden became instantly significant and impossible for investigators to ignore. The first question detectives asked was simple: why were medical papers buried in the ground? And the second question arose after they examined the sealed device's manufacturer serial code, which matched public database entries showing that the model could store encrypted notes, voice recordings, and locked access logs. The public already knew from outlets like TMZ that Hogan's widow, Sky Daly, had raised concerns about a damaged phrenic nerve during his final surgery, a claim that hinted at possible medical mistakes, and reports stated that an occupational therapist present at Hogan's home on the day he collapsed had told police that a surgeon had severed that nerve, a detail later repeated in major coverage, including the New York Post. These same stories also mentioned that Hogan's body cam footage and 911 calls had been restricted, a move that signaled the case was being treated with unusual caution. Now, with medical papers found buried in the garden, investigators saw a direct link to these earlier claims, especially since several pages, though weather-worn, carried the letterheads of regional medical clinics mentioned in public discussions of his treatment. The readable sections included terms related to atrial fibrillation, which major medical sources like the Cleveland Clinic describe as an irregular and often rapid heart rhythm, and Law and Crime had previously reported that Hogan had been diagnosed with atrial fibrillation before his death, and that his cancer, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, had also been documented as part of his medical history.
And honestly, that makes sense because we in the public had no idea that was going on. But again, what is happening right now?
But none of these conditions explained why the buried documents included unfiled medical evaluations, mentions of a second surgical opinion, and a draft letter written to Hogan's legal representative. Detectives reviewing the items found in the garden pointed out several major inconsistencies, noting that some documents carried timestamps from days before Hogan's final collapse, the sealed device had been powered on less than 48 hours before his death, and soil analysis showed that the container itself had been buried only recently based on moisture readings and ground compression. These details challenged early assumptions that Hogan had been unaware of any complications, instead suggesting he may have been privately recording concerns outside his immediate household, possibly preparing for a dispute or seeking clarity about his treatment. At the same time, the discovery intensified questions about the family's public statements, especially since Hogan's daughter, Brooke, had already used her social platforms to dispute narratives about her father's relationships, with her posts widely reported by outlets like People, ET, and Yahoo News. In those posts, which remain publicly accessible, she described receiving urgent warnings from professionals about body cam footage, emergency calls, and inconsistencies in official explanations, while also stating that she had no legal authority because those rights belonged to Hogan's widow under HIPAA regulations. Brooke's frustration became even more visible when she appeared on TMZ Live, criticizing people in her father's inner circle and accusing them of spreading lies, remarks that drew significant coverage from sites like the Daily Mail and Page 6, especially her claim that certain individuals were trying to control the story because their golden goose is gone. Comments like these fueled speculation about conflicts surrounding Hogan's estate, speculation that has only grown stronger in light of the garden discovery. While detectives continued examining the contents of the unearthed container, the property itself became a secondary focus of their investigation, as publicly available Clearwater zoning maps and county appraisal files showed that Hogan's home sat on a large plot with several secluded sections, including an area that had been redesigned multiple times over the past decade. Satellite images saved through platforms like Google Earth revealed older signs of ground disturbance in the same section where officers eventually uncovered the first container, and as the search expanded, investigators used grid pattern sweeps consistent with techniques described in open-source law enforcement manuals. During this process, they located a second, smaller metallic tube about 8 feet from the original find, and inside were 2 memory cards that required lab imaging due to corrosion, with encryption preventing any immediate on-site review, though forensic teams noted that the hardware type was commonly used for secure voice recordings. This only added to the uncertainty, raising questions about whether Hogan had been recording conversations with doctors, tracking symptoms, or preparing material for a possible legal dispute. Media reports had already pointed out irregularities in his treatment timeline, with outlets like the New York Post and Yahoo Entertainment noting that he had undergone surgery shortly before collapsing, while also highlighting that his widow's comments about the alleged surgical mistake varied in severity and who she believed was responsible, and although she publicly stated that an autopsy had been performed, she withheld its results. When paired with the buried items, these contradictions suggested that Hogan's personal understanding of his medical situation might have differed significantly from what those around him later conveyed.
He was supposed to be cremated, and TMZ reports that Sky told them again that an autopsy was conducted, but the results weren't available.
As detectives documented the evidence, the discovery directly challenged early reports claiming that Hogan's final days were calm and uneventful, especially since Law and Crime's transcript noted that he had stopped breathing suddenly without the chest tightening usually seen in cardiac arrest, and TMZ also reported that his collapse happened quickly and without warning. If Hogan had hidden medical drafts and encrypted logs shortly before his death, then the sudden nature of his collapse and the continued delay in releasing body cam footage and emergency call recordings became far more troubling. Detectives labeled the find as material of investigative value, wording commonly used in Florida cases involving unexplained medical outcomes, and from that point forward the inquiry into Hogan's death expanded beyond standard medical file checks and routine witness interviews, now involving questions of intent, concealment, and whether Hogan had been trying to privately document something about his condition that he feared would be misunderstood, dismissed, or altered after he was gone. These buried materials caused an immediate escalation within the investigative chain, and Clearwater Police, following Florida's procedures for critical incidents, transferred the garden items to their digital forensics unit, and according to earlier public comments from spokesperson Rob Shaw quoted by Law and Crime, investigators were already gathering medical records from multiple providers and speaking with numerous witnesses. Now, the presence of encrypted memory cards and unfiled medical drafts meant investigators had to determine whether Hogan had been trying to record or preserve information that differed from what his medical team or household later reported. The investigative unit requested cross-checks with regional health systems to confirm whether the recovered documents matched any official versions and public reports about Hogan's health, including coverage from People magazine regarding his atrial fibrillation and ongoing cancer treatment, showed that he had been undergoing complex medical care in the months before his death. The Cleveland Clinic, often referenced for information on atrial fibrillation, explains that the condition can cause shortness of breath, an irregular heartbeat, and increased risk during surgical procedures, and these medical realities made the draft letters found in the container even more important, especially the ones mentioning surgical complications and requests for second opinions.
It seems that there's something foul amiss. I have questions as to why the occupational therapist was at the home on the day of Hulk Hogan's death.
Public controversy over Hogan's final surgery had already been fueled by TMZ sports reports claiming that an unnamed occupational therapist at his home during his collapse told police a surgeon had damaged the phrenic nerve, which controls diaphragm function, as explained by medical sources like the Cleveland Clinic. And the buried materials now suggested that Hogan might have known about possible complications or at least been concerned enough to begin gathering documentation directly, contradicting earlier public statements that his collapse was sudden and unexpected. Clearwater police responded by placing the property under expanded perimeter monitoring, a step commonly taken in Florida when contested estates or suspicious circumstances involve high-profile figures, and Hogan's home had long drawn attention with images circulated widely on fan forums, Instagram, and entertainment sites featuring celebrity residences in the Clearwater area. As forensic teams began analyzing the memory devices, investigators also revisited body cam footage from the day Hogan was found unresponsive, and according to reports from Yahoo Entertainment and the New York Post, paramedics arrived after a 911 call reporting cardiac arrest, with his publicly circulated death certificate listing natural causes, specifically cardiac arrest related to underlying cancer and atrial fibrillation. However, the continued lockdown of the body cam recordings, noted by TMZ as unavailable due to the ongoing investigation, led detectives to consider whether the buried materials contained recordings or logs that might contradict these earlier accounts. The location of the second disturbance matched a part of Hogan's garden where he was rarely photographed, and satellite imagery from Google Earth Pro archives showed that fresh topsoil had been applied there within the previous 6 months, a detail supported by property appraisal updates from the Pinellas County database, indicating that someone had been altering the garden layout shortly before his death. During this search, detectives also uncovered a third item, a water-damaged binder containing fragments of insurance correspondence addressed to Hogan's legal representatives, with several lines still legible, including notes about pending review, recommendations for reassessment, and timeline inconsistencies, and since insurance companies typically send such communications when re-evaluating surgical claims, and Florida regulations require timely disclosure of surgical outcomes involving complications, the presence of these fragments raised questions about whether Hogan had been involved in an active insurance dispute before passing. Investigators revisited household witness statements that Hogan's widow, Sky Daly, had shared online, as reported by outlets like People and ET, noting that professionals had contacted his daughter Brooke, urging her to obtain body cam footage and 911 recordings, and Brooke explained that these files might contain information capable of altering the public narrative, though she had no legal authority over her father's medical records or cremation decisions, which legally rest with the spouse. Under HIPAA, reinforcing the legal divide that detectives now saw reflected in the buried documents.
They got a good eye for finding somebody that has the it factor. You know, they got Seth Rollins lined up. They got Logan Paul lined up, who's fresh off the block. I mean, they got a lot of good. You know, Roman Reigns is really, really hot. I could go on Cody Rhodes. I could go on and on and on, but it's going to be the survival of the quickest draw.
This quote may not have been medically relevant, but it highlighted Hogan's awareness of competition and timing, a theme detectives began incorporating into their broader timeline to consider whether he had felt pressure from unresolved business or medical matters. As the forensic team decrypted the first memory card, they found compressed data clusters consistent with voice recordings, though the timestamps were unreadable due to partial corruption, and investigators followed a multi-stage recovery protocol based on Department of Justice digital forensics guidelines. Early imaging showed at least one audio file had identifiable waveform patterns suggesting it was a continuous recording rather than segmented logs, and the encryption strength indicated Hogan had used a specialized device commonly purchased online for secure personal documentation, with listings on sites like B&H Photo Video confirming that compact recorders often include AES-level encryption for privacy, typically used by journalists, executives, or individuals managing sensitive legal or medical information. At that point, the garden discovery became the central pivot of the investigation, shifting Hogan's death from a presumed natural event into a complex forensic puzzle, with the buried items, medical, legal, and digital, pointing to unresolved events in the days before his passing and challenging the narrative that no warning signs existed. What was uncovered beneath the soil of Hogan's garden was not random clutter but evidence of a secret timeline running parallel to the public one, deliberately buried, and this was only the beginning, as the discovery fundamentally transformed the investigative framework surrounding his death. What had begun as an inquiry into a sudden medical emergency, as reported early by TMZ and Yahoo Entertainment, had now evolved into a complex forensic reconstruction of Hogan's final 90 days, with investigators implementing a 3-tier review model: medical, digital, and environmental, following frameworks from the U.S. National Institute of Justice's Forensic Investigation Guidelines. Each tier required that incoming evidence be measured against verified timelines, established medical standards, and known behavioral patterns of the deceased. The medical tier revisited Hogan's treatment history, with public reporting from People magazine and the New York Post confirming that he had undergone surgery shortly before his death and that his widow believed a compromised phrenic nerve had contributed to his collapse. The phrenic nerve's role in diaphragm function, clearly outlined by medical authorities like the Cleveland Clinic, emphasized the gravity of this claim, as damage to it could produce progressive symptoms such as shortness of breath, fatigue, and respiratory difficulty, which are often mistaken for cardiac irregularities. This was particularly significant because Hogan's official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest linked to chronic lymphocytic leukemia and atrial fibrillation, and references from organizations like the American Heart Association describe atrial fibrillation as an arrhythmia capable of causing sudden collapse while also producing early warning signs that trained medical professionals or patients could detect. Investigators now questioned whether the early symptoms had been recorded in the encrypted logs recovered from the garden, while the environmental tier examined the physical burial of the documents, with horticultural experts consulting regional databases and using criteria similar to those from the University of Florida IFAS extension to help determine if the soil disruption could be explained by normal maintenance. Their analysis indicated the burial took place within weeks of Hogan's death, with soil compression patterns suggesting a single person had rapidly buried the items using shallow manual techniques rather than storing them long-term. If Hogan had buried the materials himself, it implied he was physically capable of digging, challenging claims that he collapsed without prior distress, whereas if someone else buried them, it raised the possibility of concealment after his death. The digital tier focused on the encrypted memory cards, with forensic analysts noting that the first card contained audio waveform patterns consistent with long-duration recordings, potentially capturing conversations with healthcare providers or personal symptom documentation, while the second card held fragmented text blocks resembling typed notes or draft statements, with a directory name, Sessions, and one corrupted fragment reading, Doctor, reinforcing the idea that Hogan had been recording or outlining medical concerns before his death. Investigators then expanded their timeline to include every publicly verified appearance Hogan made in 2023 and 2024.
When you were working out, like when you're still working out, obviously, you look in great shape.
Trying.
I always heard from someone like it was good to drink beers while working out because it dehydrated and you really get beer muscles. Is that true?
The recording depicted Hogan as physically active and engaged, far from incapacitated, yet investigators recognized that outward appearance can differ sharply from private medical reality, a point reinforced by analyses from the National Cancer Institute explaining that chronic lymphocytic leukemia can remain outwardly silent while seriously reducing resilience. The garden discovery challenged prior assumptions and shifted focus to household dynamics, as public reports highlighted significant tension between Hogan's widow and his children, with the clearest insight coming from Brooke Hogan's statements widely covered by People and Entertainment Tonight, in which she emphasized that professionals present during her father's collapse had contacted her, urging her to obtain body cam footage and 911 audio allegedly containing information that contradicted the official narrative, and the People report summarizing her post remains a frequently cited source. Detectives noted that Brooke's statements contained multiple red flags aligning with the emerging timeline, as several professionals reached out independently, an unusual pattern unless they believed the official reports were missing critical context, and she claimed she had been urged to view the body cam and 911 recordings, which TMZ had reported were locked due to an ongoing investigation, while also asserting that witnesses felt compelled to speak out, consistent with whistleblowing patterns described by organizations like the Government Accountability Project. Brooke repeatedly suggested she knew more than she could act on, implying access to details that conflicted with her mother's version of events, a tension reminiscent of estate disputes common in high-profile families, frequently analyzed in public cases by Forbes and the ABA Journal, and detectives considered whether conflicts over access, authority, and inheritance might have contributed to the burial of sensitive materials in Hogan's garden. Investigators also revisited Sky Daily's Instagram posts preserved in media recaps by Yahoo Entertainment and Page 6, in which she maintained that an autopsy had been conducted, though the results were never released publicly. She stated that Hogan's cremation had been delayed until all questions about his medical care were resolved. and her insistence that misinformation was being spread by faceless AI accounts and individuals not close enough to understand the situation came across as defensive, particularly in light of the newly discovered buried materials. At this point, analysts began reconstructing Hogan's daily movements using data from public sightings, social media posts, business records from Hogan's hangout, and security camera lighting reports from Clearwater Beach. Several witness accounts emerged on Reddit's r² circle, describing Hogan as moving slower than usual and holding his side, and while anecdotal, investigators compared these observations with medical research from the Journal of Thoracic Disease, which details symptoms of phrenic nerve dysfunction, including reliance on accessory muscles for breathing, reduced exercise tolerance, and difficulty with positional breathing.
And if there was any type of shortness of breath or any type of issues that could have been associated with his atrial fibrillation, because sometimes you have shortness of breath with AFib. So maybe if he was having that, maybe his wife, who's not a medical professional, thought, oh, it's just the AFib, we'll take your medicine and continue on doing what we're doing.
The alignment raised suspicion, suggesting that if Hogan buried sensitive materials, he may have done so because he believed his care was inadequate or anticipated a dispute after his death, while the encrypted device recovered from the container offered the most compelling potential evidence. Tech analysts noted that similar devices sold through B&H Photo and Adorama often feature AES-256 encryption, fail-safe autolocking, timestamp logs, and the ability to record conversations discreetly, meaning that if Hogan had used such a recorder with clinicians, attorneys, or household members, investigators could gain direct insight into his state of mind. Forensic technicians completed a preliminary reconstruction of one file cluster, and although the audio remained unplayable, metadata showed it was created within 4 days of Hogan's collapse. TMZ and the New York Post reported that investigators labeled this file 04A, which exceeded 32 minutes in length, far longer than a simple personal memo, making it a central point of interest. Investigators then reached out to the anonymous professionals who allegedly contacted Brooke, and while their identities were not publicly disclosed, media coverage confirmed multiple healthcare workers had been present at Hogan's home during his collapse, aligning with Brooke's statements and TMZ's reporting that therapists or medical staff had told police about a possible surgical error. Clearwater Police cross-referenced these individuals' employment histories using public databases such as the NPP's NPI registry to verify credentials, strengthening the credibility of their concerns. Officers also revisited Hogan's publicly circulated death certificate, which listed the manner of death as natural, but investigators noted that Florida law permits corrections or amendments when new evidence emerges, as outlined by the Florida Bureau of Vital Statistics, meaning the buried materials could trigger a legal revision if inconsistencies required medical reevaluation. The decrypted metadata confirming that Hogan personally recorded File 04A fundamentally redirected the investigation, prompting Clearwater Police to treat the audio not as supplementary evidence but as a primary source artifact, elevating its analysis priority under Florida investigative protocols in line with FDLE guidance for high-profile cases. Because Hogan created the recording himself, the file offered direct insight into his intentions, perceptions, and experiences in the days immediately preceding his death, and digital specialists began reconstructing the damaged audio using forensic recovery tools based on methodologies from the National Institute of Standards and Technology regarding corrupted files. Although the file remained partially unplayable, analysts were able to extract enough waveform data to confirm human speech and isolate at least 2 distinct speakers, leading investigators to theorize that the second voice could belong to a medical professional, legal advisor, family member, or someone involved in his care during his final days. To identify this voice, analysts compared the waveform's pitch and resonance with publicly available recordings of individuals known to have interacted with Hogan shortly before his death, including interviews, podcasts, and public appearances archived on platforms like YouTube and official WWE media, and while early comparisons were inconclusive, the file's duration of over 32 minutes suggested a structured, intentional conversation rather than a simple personal memo. If Hogan had recorded medical concerns related to symptoms such as shortness of breath, accessory muscle breathing, or positional respiratory difficulty, this would directly contradict public claims that his collapse occurred without warning. Forensic reconstruction of File 04A continued, with audio engineers identifying phonetic clusters resembling terms like procedure, breathing, nerve, and follow-up, which corresponded with topics typically discussed during surgical complication consultations, and investigators cross-referenced these clusters with public medical literature on post-surgical complications from chest or neck procedures, including resources from the Journal of Thoracic Disease, while also reviewing regional medical provider logs to identify appointments that might align with the recording's timeframe, consistent with Florida's medical record retention rules enforced by the Florida Board of Medicine requiring accurate, time-stamped documentation of visits, consultations, and evaluations. While the exact provider involved in the recording could not yet be identified, investigators noted that Hogan had several follow-up appointments scheduled during the same week as the recording, confirmed through appointment. Reminders in email logs voluntarily provided by some clinics under subpoena, reinforcing the likelihood that File 04A captured a medical consultation that Hogan personally recorded without the provider's knowledge. Secretly recording medical conversations is legal in Florida, a one-party consent state under Florida Statute 934.03, as long as the person recording is part of the conversation, which explained the device's presence on Hogan's property and suggested he may have been gathering evidence to document or challenge inconsistencies in his care. At the same time, detectives examined the environmental evidence, with soil analysis indicating the burial occurred no more than 104 days before Hogan's death, and moisture retention and organic decomposition rates benchmarked against environmental baselines from the University of Florida IFAS extension confirming that the burial was recent and done in a hurry, while the soil layering patterns suggested the materials were placed in a hastily dug trench rather than stored for the long term. Investigators also reviewed Hogan's final public appearances, and although unverified, these observations aligned with possible symptoms of respiratory impairment and complications associated with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, raising further questions about what he may have been documenting and why the public narrative did not reflect these warning signs.
But with the police statement, with Brooks' statement, with this idea of a compromised nerve, how can we not address what's happening?
The investigation took its most dramatic turn when forensic technicians finally recovered 8 seconds of audible speech from File 04A, and though most of it was garbled, one phrase spoken clearly by Hogan was identifiable: "Keep everything safe until after," with the final word indistinguishable due to digital corruption, but the intent unmistakable, suggesting Hogan wanted the material secured until a specific event, likely his death, pending the remainder of the recording. Forensic phoneticists compared the recovered speech with public audio from interviews and confirmed a near-perfect match, verifying it was unquestionably Hogan, while analysts also detected faint speech from a second voice, though it remained unintelligible, prompting voice profile comparisons against recordings of his associates, medical professionals, and household members using methods described by the International Association for Forensic Phonetics and Acoustics. Detectives were now confident that the recording captured Hogan expressing urgent concerns and possibly giving instructions for safeguarding specific information, and if the buried documents aligned with these instructions, it indicated he deliberately preserved evidence he feared could be destroyed or misrepresented after his death, shedding new light on the urgency in Brooke Hogan's public statements referencing professionals who urged her to obtain body cam footage and 911 recordings. What had once seemed like a strange irregularity in the garden had become the central clue in Hogan's final story, leading detectives to a working theory. Hogan, worried about his health, the quality of his medical care, and the accuracy of what would be reported after his death, recorded conversations with medical professionals and advisors, compiled documents, drafted letters, and prepared files, then, anticipating resistance or suppression, concealed them in his garden with the expectation they would be found later, though someone else may have discovered or attempted to bury the story. The investigation had shifted from questioning how Hogan died to uncovering what he knew before his death and who sought to hide those details. Well, that's it for this video, but don't go anywhere because there's plenty more heat coming. Tap any of the cards on your screen now and stay locked in.